Thank you all for being here and for taking time out of your evening. I wanted to start off by acknowledging that we here at SFU are residing, working, playing on the lands of the traditional and unceded territories of the Salish people, including the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also wanted to take a minute out, especially since our event is on anti-Asian racism in BC, to acknowledge that my own journey has very much been one where I've had to work to understand what that means. As someone who, after coming to BC, saw herself as having lost some of the power that came from being a professor back in Pakistan, I simultaneously had to work to understand, read to understand that I am still an uninvited settler, and what that means, the fact that I'm still wielding, without even thinking about it, power that comes from proximity and complicity with settler colonialism. And again, the differences between that and the stories of decolonization that I've been teaching for 10 years across Asia and Africa is something that I'm trying to incorporate within my courses based on the knowledge that have been accumulated here. My name is Anusha Malik. I am here today as your moderator to speak with these amazing women who I've had the pleasure of meeting in a personal capacity first. And the reason why that's important is because what I really wanted us to do was to hear from the amazing work that they've done, but also the people that they are, that have made them go on this journey. So on that note, I don't want today to be just a story of what racism looks like, not just what it feels like, but also about the joy and resistance that has come from building community and relationships that can stand against it. I want to think about that joy and those relationships, which, as someone who is a relative newcomer to BC, you know, these women have provided for me, at least, in the spaces that now feel meaningful for me. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce them. We have Dr. Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra, who is a coordinator of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of Fraser Valley. She wears many, many hats, so we're going to talk about some of them through what she's going to tell us. She's also a co-curator of exhibits at the Sikh Heritage Museum, located in the National Historic Site, the Sikh Temple in Abbotsford, BC. She is also sessional faculty in the Department of History at the University of the Fraser Valley. Sharn's PhD looked at the effective, and I'm saying look because she is a doctor, so in past tense, at the effective experiences of racialized museum visitors through a critical race theory lens. She's a passionate activist, building bridges between community and academia through museum work. She is a past member of the BC Museums Association and currently a director with the Pacific Canada Heritage Centre and the Museum of Migration. Kareen, who is sitting on the left. Kareen, if you raise your hand for those of you who don't know who you are. Kareen also I've met in these wonderful circumstances, and in fact Kareen is my co-organizer today as part of the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, which is really the force that's been organizing this event. Kareen's introduction reads as such, and I'm just going to read what Kareen sent me. I humbly acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest unlearning and relearning on the stolen, occupied, and joint territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam. I am a K-12 public school teacher. She's a union activist, a community organizer, and outside of the classroom, does anti-oppression work through roles with the BC Teachers Federation and the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance. Decolonizing structures and epistemology is a lifelong pursuit, and she is a firm believer of liberation and transformative justice. I just want to point out, if you haven't looked her up and read some of the stuff that she's written as well, you definitely should. She's also been an absolutely fantastic influence for me as someone who's constantly reminded us in every session with the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, have you thought about how we are also settler colonial subjects? And actually, Corinne, no, we hadn't thought about that. So thank you for that. Rohini, who also goes by Ria, Aurora, another fantastic force of nature who blew me away the first time we met, and that was on Zoom. And I thought, that's it, okay, I have to know you better. She's a community builder and organizer with a background in electoral politics and labor. She spent nearly a decade campaigning across Canada to help elect progressive governments. She's passionate about campaigns, worker rights, race equity, and creating space for more progressive racialized women in politics and labor. She currently works for the BC Federation of Labour as a director of organizing and campaigns, and her experiences through work have led her to recognize that electoral politics and the labour movement are where the lived and shared experiences of racialized people can have maximum impact with respect to equitable legislation and building power through community. She has now turned her attention to her own municipality of Burnaby and recently ran and won the nomination for the Burnaby Citizens Association to run as one of their candidates for City Council in the upcoming election this October. This is the stuff you will find out about all these women online. I want us to focus on the others, the stuff that isn't always visible. And so our conversations and the questions we plan is really focused around that. Please feel free to do further introductions as we go along, but let's start with the first question that we thought of. What we're doing here is I put up a quote which I'll read out to you guys from the fantastic scholar of colonialism, Cameroonian historian of African studies, Ashili, who also focuses on decolonization within the African context. So the quote from them is on the left, and the question that I'll be asking them is on the right, so you can refer to that as we talk. So the first question, guys. I would like to start at the very beginning. When we spoke earlier, we talked about the symbols, like the paintings hung in a school, the people who are the main players in our history textbooks, that give us a sense of who we are and who we cannot be. And against that backdrop, I wanted to ask you to reflect on any childhood memories that stand out for you that first made you aware of who you are. Whatever that means to you, how your family maybe conveyed this sense of identity to you, of how to behave, of how to dress, the importance of organizing or being in the community, and the sense you develop of your own history and ancestry. Please, Sharon, if you could start.
Okay. Okay. So I think when I reflect on my childhood, so I have lived in Abbotsford for most of my life, so 32 years living in Abbotsford. And so I went to elementary and high school and university there for my undergraduate degree. This question really made me reflect on things that just stay the same in so many different ways. So we were having great conversations on the ride here about how much of a struggle it is to fight not only against racism, but in the Abbotsford context, evangelical racism as well. So there is a huge Bible Belt in the Fraser Valley region. And as I was reflecting on this question, I remember that in every, elementary school celebration around Christmas time, we would read Bible verses, right, in a public school space. But it was so normalized that it was just a given fact that you would be reading songs or singing songs that are Bible verses. And now fast forward to me being a mom, so my child is 13 in middle school, and his school, middle school, sends him to a trip to Trinity Western University to talk about science and biology. And mind-blowing, I know, right? And mind-blowing in the sense that I have to be practical when I critique, because it's so hard when you're fighting these systems to get resistance. So I pulled their covenant, and I said their covenant is homophobic, because you cannot, it says something about, a man and woman can only be in a relationship. And I said, you are sending our children to a school where the faculty have to sign a homophobic covenant. And it's been resisted since then. The educators are resisting. And I just found out today, before leaving to come here, and I was really upset, almost crying in the vehicle driving here, that my son is now going to a camp that is a Christian camp as a part of their trip this month. It's like it never ends sometimes, right? Like it's like 30 years from me being in elementary school to to now me fighting the same things for my child. The difference is that my child is aware of everything that's taking place. The difference is that when I put this out on social media, I have a habit of putting everything out publicly. I will shame, first and foremost. And then I'll say, let's have a conversation. We were saying, not everybody agrees with that. People don't like me because I do that. But I'm really tired of having to have these backdoor conversations where people don't know the full truth of what is happening. So I shamed. I didn't name the school because of safety reasons for me and my child, but I said, my school is doing this, my son's school. People responded, CBC reporters saying, what is happening? How is this happening? And I went to the school and I said, do you see the responses? Do you see how you are not reading the room as a public school? So my answer to the question is, so much does not change, like so much does not change when you're trying to fight these systems. The difference now is, how did I find belonging back then when I was a child, and how has my child found belonging? And that is through my mother tongue. So I grew up in Edmonton going to Punjabi school, and we did Sunday school type thing where we would learn our language, we would learn our religion and our faith. Everything that was pushing against me to be ashamed of who I am was empowered by learning my mother tongue. My son is the same. He goes to a local government center in Abbotsford. He does volunteering at the spring and summer camps. He knows his Sikh studies and history. So no matter how much people try to change you and tell you that you are less than, we can find our own solace and our empowerment through learning our own mother tongue, learning our own history, learning the resistance of our communities. The sad thing is that he still has to do this, right, 30 years later. So that's a quick, short answer of that, and more to come. Yeah, that's true.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
If I can ask Corinne, you to reflect on the same question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sharn, for going ahead. Actually, that is helping me structure my thinking as well. I don't have biological children of my own. I teach, so I see my students as my children. My niece is right here. She's also my child. So, and I mean, being a teacher, and I often go into a classroom. So I teach on a call these days. I don't have my own classroom. I would often tell students that I became a teacher because I did not have a grand time in school. I don't necessarily go into details. Sometimes I do. It really depends on the context. But I'm a first-generation immigrant, so I came here when I was almost 12. And I grew up in a convent Catholic school in Hong Kong. And then I went on to grade 7 and now in a public system in BC, in Vancouver actually. So the context is a little bit different. Like Abbotsford and Vancouver.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it is different, but there are similar grades as well, right? And my experience has been, through the family. First and foremost, I was a girl. My mother really wanted a son. I came from a family of 3 girls. I'm glad that I never had a brother. Just thinking how it would have been like if there had been a boy, when my mother so wanted a boy. And I went to an all-girls school, so gender was a huge thing, and I was sexually mature. And growing up in a Catholic environment, it was very difficult. There's a lot of shaming, there's a lot of punishment, there's a lot of just saying no. And, Hong Kong being a colonial, a British colony, different than Canada being a settler colony, it was more of an economic and extractive colony. It was difficult because as a child you receive conflicting information. So on the one hand, in the textbooks, in social studies class, you learn how you're proud to be a Hong Konger. It's a prosperous city. Capitalism is front and center. And there's, of course, like this natural pride of being Chinese, and Chinese is a loaded term. So I identify culturally as Chinese. Obviously, I spoke Cantonese. I learned Chinese in school, right? And that was my cultural identity. But yet, you're very, very aware since a very young age that there was a hierarchy. There were South Asian neighbors as well living in Hong Kong, and it's very stratified, right? I just remember Punjabi men were always the ones stationed outside a bank, And you would see them in the police or military ranks sometimes. So, you know, there are all these markers that, you know, you may not really learn about and parents don't talk about it or teachers don't talk about it. But as a child, you really absorb these things and you internalize them. And I didn't have the language to articulate what that meant, but I knew that there was a hierarchy. I knew what it meant to be a woman, a girl, and I knew what it meant to be a boy or a man. I also knew I slept in the same room with a live-in domestic helper, and she was Filipino. She was a second mother to me. It's always hard for me to talk about her. And I would say that, you know, that dehumanizing policy of labor and immigration, right, has put, I think, the society, especially the middle class society, in close proximity to these women from the Philippines, from Thailand, from Indonesia, who really, really sacrifice a lot of their personal lives. And you are living with them, you're eating with them. And yet, again, these very children, they grow up understanding that they are literally less than human. So it's very complicated without even going into, you know, the Catholicism and all of that. But just, I think one piece that I would add is my parents have very different backgrounds. And so speaking of the complexity of being Chinese, my father came, his own father came to Hong Kong as a refugee from mainland China. And so Hong Kong was, before the 60s, 50s and 60s, kind of before Second World War, was a really poorly managed, you know, kind of city. It was run amok by, you know, a lot of gangs and violence, because the British really had no interest in governing it well. That was not their interest. It was really situated, like where it was situated. It was strategic as a port city. It was really used to pillage and to skim the fat off the trade, right? And so it wasn't until later, and I was born in the 70s, and so I never saw that part of history, and I never learned that, right? You don't learn about it. You just learn about how great it is now. And so there's that historical amnesia. And you didn't really learn about Chinese history as a subject until senior high. And then again, I believe it was an elective. So, you know, you would hear bits and pieces, because my older sister, you know, was maybe taking that. So, you know, you just hear bits and pieces, and as a child, I just have to say that it was confusing. The idea was that, you know, you try your best to get ahead, and that was your job. And that was really it. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much for that, Shareen. And you're absolutely right. This idea of the histories that are missing, they end up having an effect on us because we see that those histories that matter to us are not being told in those spaces, which is exactly what we were discussing. Rohini, can I ask you to respond to the question?
Yeah, you know, I was listening and reflecting as you were talking, and you know, there is this experience that you have when you're the child of immigrants from another country in this country. And so I belong to a religious minority, similar as Sharn, in India. And so we're a minority there, and we're a minority here. And early on, it was very clear, and it was made very clear to me of the self-determination that our community had. And I really thank my parents for sitting me down and constantly talking about it. How much attention did I pay at 4, 5, and 6? I tried to absorb as much as I could. But, you know, I would have questions sometimes. I remember driving down a street and seeing, I think it was the Skina Gurdwara, and that is a place that we go, that's our faith, a place of faith and worship. And I remember reading Sikh, S-I-K-H, and I remember saying to my mom, is that where people go to the hospital? Because I was young. And so my mom goes, no, that's not how you, that's a different kind of Sikh. And I remember it prompted this conversation as we're driving down the street. And she said, you know, our community feeds everyone at the same time. There's volunteers in the back. You know, we can go and volunteer as well. And so that sense of community was talked about quite a bit. But then being a child navigating at home I'm in Punjab with my family, and then I go outside and now I'm in this Canadian and all the various institutions that come with it. And of course, at that point, thinking about colonialism and its effects was not clear to me. I didn't really understand what was going on. But once I hit 6 or 7 years old, it really started to stick out to me in a strange way. For example, you know, there was this conversation about British colonialism and the impact it had on India in the 18th and 19th centuries. And partition was talked about quite often. I didn't really exactly know what partition meant, but by 6 or 7, I actually had a sense of what they were talking about. So there was a shift, you know, just in the first few years, formative years really, where I started to grasp that our relationship to our land was very deep in India. And then here I am, and you know, fast forward to grade 5 or 6, and we're learning about social studies, and you know, white people and Indigenous people shook hands, and it was, you know, it's fine, we have Thanksgiving. And so I was a bit thrown off by that because, of course, you know, as you get older and you start to realize that what the reality is, and there was something inside me that told me something was wrong. I couldn't put words to it, and like you said, I couldn't articulate what I was thinking or what I was feeling. And there was some point, and you know, I work in politics and labor, so my brain always frames things like that, but I remember seeing the TV, and there was a bunch of, you know, white men in a fancy carpet on the TV, and I remember saying to my mom, how come we're not there? And I had this sense that, oh, we're other, we're not, you know, we're not white people. And so that space is not for us. And my mom's words will always stick with me because there were 2 words in my language, but basically she said, make your own way. And so that's been an undertone and part of my identity really, where coming from a community where self-determination was a reality. In fact, we had to have this like dialogue with the government because our very lives depended on it. And so that hasn't changed very much here. But it's not just the Sikh community that I'm really thinking about. It's anyone that's not part of the white majority. And that includes Indigenous people as well. And so I've gone off on a tangent here because that's what I always do. But, you know, yeah, I recognize that I can't preach or talk about change unless I'm actively taking steps. Don't say preach. We talked about it to throw you off. No, you know, at the end of the day, there's work that we have to do continuously, and we use our experiences to frame up why we do the work we do, or where we're coming from, or even just the passion and why it comes up for us. But we really, as a community in this country on borrowed land, stolen land, I should say, that's much more appropriate, we really have to take a step back and say, if we're going to dismantle these very systems, we're going to actually have to get richer with knowledge. And once that happens at the K-12 level, academically, and even with our politicians, we can potentially see real change. Because like you said, there's been a fair bit of time where nothing has changed. Yeah, I'm 34 years old today, and you're right, because I met this fabulous young South Asian woman who works for a cooperative, and she was sharing that, you know, her experience in school was exactly like mine. And it hurt me, you know, it hit me in my heart, and I thought, wow, really? Some things remain stagnant, but that just shows how much we can do when we build collective power internally between our various communities, regardless of where we're from. Or, like you said, you know, you came from Hong Kong and what you were taught there, and even coming here, your experience with colonialism, same with our family. We're British, we're members of the British Raj. That's why we were able to come to Canada. And so we really have to reckon with that. I'll stop there.
That was a fantastic tangent. Thank you very much. Thank you all. That was absolutely amazing. I wanted to, it's actually, I'm cheating a little bit because I've already spoken to them and then picked the quotes that you see in front of you. So, so it was actually on that basis that this really resonated for me. And again, I've spent most of my career teaching on decolonization, a context where we talked about the other context of Asia and Africa, where, you know, the colonial state left, and then you had to deal with a different sort of decolonization, right? There are similarities, it's just not the same thing. And while I was talking to all three of our speakers today, I really felt this one, which is Membe saying, as it happens, the great myth of the 19th century and of our time was that of race. It was believed that one and only one people were the real representation of the world spirit, and other nations are absolutely without right. It was a structuring force, a fiction able to produce its own reality. And I felt while I was talking to them, these guys were making this theoretical discussion down in the everyday, that's able to produce its reality through your experiences, through what you see as a child, through what you come to recognize as authority. And it's there that things really need to change. If we can move to the second question, please. I wanted to invite you now to think about transitions. I'm just going to change. It's the second quote. I'll read it out to you. It's a little bit smaller than I hoped. I wanted to invite you now to think about transitions, by which I mean transitions to adulthood, to realizing that this work, the work that all of you do, was going to become one of the structuring principles that organized your life. So I wanted to invite you guys to tell us if there is one moment that you can recall in which you realized that something drastic would have to change, or just thought, no, enough, bus. From that moment, maybe you could take us to the work you turned toward, to the extent that there was a turning, as opposed to a constant movement. Can I please? Okay. Sorry.
So, no, sorry. I do have an exact moment. So I was like 21, 22, and throughout my whole high school life, caste was kind of a hovering concept in our communities. So caste is a, how do I explain it? It comes out of the Hindu Varna system, and it's based on your category as in a certain space. So you could be a Brahmin, which is a priestly class. You could be a Kshatriya, which is the warrior class, and then a farmer class, and then it goes down into various categories. So that system has inculcated the Sikh space as well, and Sikh religion, even though our first teacher said there is no caste. But regardless, the caste system hovers around us all the time. So throughout my high school life, I was a staunch anti-caste, and I said, I don't believe in the caste system, I don't believe in caste bias or discrimination, and so that was the philosophy I went with. And then I met my now husband when I was in my early 20s, who was not of the same caste as me. And so when he and I were seeing each other, the first question my parents asked is, what caste is he? And I told them, he's this caste. And they said, no, you can't marry him. He's not the right caste. In that moment, after many years of struggling and trying to convince them, we actually eloped. So I eloped and ran away from home and married my husband, and we just celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary last month as well. Yeah. But that moment for me was really important because I had always been the really good daughter who always listened to what everybody said and just was very like the pushover daughter. The oldest daughter in the South Asian family is usually the one who has to really put up with a lot.
That wasn't my experience.
Oh, mine too. We should talk later. Yeah. I was the good one. So for me, it was a decision to say I've lived with a certain philosophy around anti-oppression, around believing, caste is wrong, and I love my husband, and I want to, or my boyfriend then, and I'm going to marry him. And that's what I did. Now, caste still is rampant in our community. Caste discrimination plays when we talk about labor, caste bias within school. A lot of international students face caste discrimination as well. So it exists everywhere. And I've taught my children now to be anti-caste as well. And for the first time, I told my 13-year-old, I said, do you understand why I have not the best relationship with Nana Nani, which is my mom and dad? And right away he said, is it because of caste? Like he knew at 13, yeah, right away. Because I've taught them that, right? And when we use the language of anti-racism, for example, people often say, well, we don't teach our kids about race, right? That's actually a problem. You actually need to teach children about issues of race and anti-racism or systems of discrimination and systemic structures, just like I have to teach my child caste system, why we're against it, why we don't believe in it, what are some opposite knowledges that we can bring to the table. So he can say, I don't know what caste, not just I don't know what caste is, but I'm anti-caste. So that moment and for me has built my whole life to be about anti-oppression. And just then beginning to learn over time with my education in particular, but also seeing my children as my legacy. Like, we talk a lot about the work that we are doing. The work that we are doing sitting on the stage isn't about us. It's about your students, right? It's about your niece. It's about my children. It's about your sister and your family and your mom seeing this. It's about the legacies that we carry with us. So they are going to be the benefactors of these conversations and the work that we are doing. And that is why we have to look at everything as anti-oppressive. Everything. Yes, it is always about race. Yes, it is always about yes, it is. It is. You have to make it about that. And that's okay, because for so long we didn't make it about that. So yeah.
And I have to say, I mean, it's such a good point, because often it's like people feel discomfort because you're talking about it. And it's like, what about the people experiencing it? It's very limited.
Yeah.
And I used to be worried about bringing it up at the dinner table with friends, because they would say, no, Rhea, no politics. Don't talk about that. I said, well, you know what? It comes with the territory. If you don't want me here, then...
And also unpack, when people say it's political, it's not political talk to talk about race, it's our life. It's our lived experience. It's political to talk about politics, right? But it's not political to talk about race and oppression and harm, real harm. We were talking about burnout, like the real harm that takes place on our bodies and our spirits when we go home. Me, I was deflated when I found out my son's going to this camp. Deflated after fighting so much. Now I have to carry this with me for a month. Now I have to imagine, okay, how am I going to have another conversation with the teachers who hate me already? Is this going to impact my child's education? We carry this in our blood and our veins on a daily basis. So it's exhausting. It's utterly exhausting.
But can I just say that I'm really jealous?
Oh.
Because I learned that, the Sikh community has had this history of resistance.
Yeah.
And I mean, resisting is hard.
Yes.
But I almost feel like culturally you have this knowledge, you've inherited that history of resistance.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like, like coming from my context, I feel like it's something that I have to learn from ground zero. And I'm just digging now into the history of resistance of my people, which is very different. And I think that context, being a minority, from, wherever your homeland is, like I actually see that as richness. It's strength. It's like, you're stronger where you're broken, right? Like, it's kind of like that. And I think, when you're talking about how, you make that into race, you bring that, not conflict, but you bring that discussion, you bring that angle into things. It's like, sometimes I feel like I grew up being very used to, and I still see it today, like folks like myself who are very comfortable making themselves small or fit into the shape of that standardized mold, right? That carpet, that event.
And we have that too.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure
so it's the model minority obsession. Yeah. But I have to say, resistance isn't always resistance in the way we see it. You knowing your mother tongue is resistance, right? You refusing to just learn English is resistance, and you continuing that is resistance. Can be in so many different ways. You teaching the way you teach your students is resistance every So we have to flip how we see resistance and say every little thing we do is resistance.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so important. Yeah.
No, I totally agree. I just, you know, and I think I might be moving into the third question a little bit, is that, you know, it's really like finding that community who would support you in doing the different kinds of resistance, because you're right, like resistances, there are many different types, right? But I also think, you know, there's a time for, you know, like with youth, you know, children, it could be, you know, through your culture, your language, you know. And then, you know, as they get older, it's about political consciousness. Yeah. And I think passing that threshold into something that's less comfortable, that's less about the songs and the music and the language and the food, and moving into the more difficult topics, that is where I think the challenge is. Yeah. And this is where I think, you know, where I am envious of where you're coming from. But
I think it's very
oh.
I have to keep talking.
Oh, I wish I had a story. I wish there was a turning point. I have to say that I don't. Back to my point about how children know injustice when they see it. Like there's just been so many moments that I think that no, this is it. It cannot be. Like there were just so numerous. However, again, moving into the third question, I think what was a turning point for me is about finding community. Because you alone, thinking that this is not right, I just remember many, many fights with my parents, right? And it's just, you know, and after 100 screaming matches, because you disagree with what they think, you give up and you don't try, right? What's the point? So it's really, I think, finding other people, finding the community of resistance. That for me is when it clicked. Not that, you know, no, this is enough, but no, this is enough, and I think I know what I can do next. So I'll stop there. I'll let you transition us into the third.
Please go right ahead. Your story.
Yeah, so mine actually has to do with caste as well, because it is something that's really prevalent in our community. And it's come up time and time again. It's not that my parents sat there and discussed it, or that it was a major topic at the dinner table. It was more so that, like you said, like someone's getting married, you're at someone's house and there's discussion between the moms, and you hear your dads, usually they go separate, right? The women go towards the kitchen and do all the cooking, the men chill and hang out. That's another conversation for another day. But you know, I would overhear conversations about, oh, what caste are they, where are they from? Oh, yeah, no. There's this distaste, or this sort of looking down at others. And it was done through such casual conversation, and yet we all picked it up, right? Oh, okay, that's not okay, that's okay. You sort of start to have these boxes of this is okay to do, this is not. But my story is actually in India. I was visiting family, and I wanted to use the washroom in the house. There was a small washroom upstairs on the second floor. And I went to go in there, and somebody yanked me out and said, you cannot use that washroom. That washroom is not for you. And I said, why? And they said, it's for the people that are working here. And that hit me really hard. I thought, but they take such good care. Why would you separate? I couldn't fathom that while they're smiling and talking to each other and doing stuff together all day, every day for years, they have one cup and one plate that they're allowed to use. And this is still happening today in our community in India. And this mentality, like a huge swath of people from India came through the point system in the 1970s and 80s. And they brought this mentality with them. And years later, I remember, you know, having a conversation with my mom and dad, and I really lucked out. My parents, you know, I was brought up in the worker consciousness. My mom fought for the rights of Indian nurses and came from that perspective, and really always said, stand in your truth is your power. You know, you don't need anything else. And I remember talking with them about this, and they would agree. And yet in conversation, sorry mom, in conversation sometimes, you know, I could see that she would make herself small so that she wasn't making it difficult for the other people around. Like she didn't want to bring it up because she felt it wasn't the right place in that moment, you know, whether it was a 1-minute moment or an hour-long conversation. But I remember thinking, if this mentality is in India, with all of the socio-political, geopolitical context, all of the things, and then people are moving to another country where, first of all, you're not welcome here. You know, you weren't welcomed by the people of this land specifically. And you're bringing this mentality, gosh, the layers. There's so many layers, and I think it's one thing to acknowledge it, it's another thing to actively work towards being anti-oppression, anti-caste, anti-classism, anti-colorism. All of that still exists within our communities. And you know, obviously within these institutions, when we think about structural and institutional racism and the impact that it has on so many communities, that's one thing. We also have to think about it within our own communities. It's extremely important. The amount of times that I've faced lateral violence and that hurt me so deeply, and there's a hurt there that's deeper than it is with when it comes from white people.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to again read out this quote to you guys, partially because also, you know, much of what we've heard today is also can't be disconnected from the colonial encounter when the British, for example, in the South Asian context, respected authority based on birth, respected that kind of lineage and locked it in law such that it became hard to shake afterward. And this is what Fanon meant when he talked about, he said, it was necessary, Frantz Fanon said, and this is again in the Membe's words, to turn one's back on this Europe, i.e. this idea of Europe. Fanon did not just propose to not follow this Europe, he proposed leaving it because its game was up. The time had come to go on to something else. But how? By walking all the time, night and day, in the company of man, in the company of all men. Of course, we would say not all men, but all genders, not binaries. They, Fanon, and they had some issues that they didn't see. We can focus on that. For him, this is what made the decolonized community a walking community, a community of walkers, a vast universal caravan. For others, this vast universal caravan could only be achieved by looking upon Europe with solicitude and compassion, and breathing back into it the supplement of humanity it had lost. So whatever your aims may be, building community is one of the things they're hoping to move toward. And on that note, I wanted to turn to our last question for today, which is I wanted to ask all of you to share a piece of poetry, prose, or an artwork that captures what your work or your community means to you. It can be something that evokes strong feelings, it can be, you know, something that just resonates for you. It doesn't have to be directly related to the talk in any direct way, but if you could share it with us and then tell us what it brings forth for you, please. I haven't asked so far, but you guys need the mic.
I think we're loud.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're good.
You can hear us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to go in a different order this time? So it's not just me starting?
You guys decide the order. I'm going to just go ahead and hand it to you and say.
Maybe? Go.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So my sister is, just giving you context here. My sister's getting married, and so my house is being painted, and my dad was a published poet, and I really wanted to bring some poetry from him, but couldn't find it because of everything being moved around. So I would say that something that's really stuck with me is I have a dear friend named Rana Ayub. She's an investigative journalist in India, and she wrote a book called The Anatomy of a Cover-Up, she wrote a massive expose actually on Amit Shah, who is the Home Minister of India, and of Modi, and his actions in the Gujarat riots in 2002. She came here to visit, and she was, you know, meeting with so many different folks, and we ended up having a chat for a bit, and I remember we were talking about, you know, our social issues, our values, our where we come from. I mean, what she did was a big deal. She wore a mic underneath her clothes and walked in where there were, you know, there was imminent danger, and she went into work every day to get the truth out. And so, you know, we were talking about the work that we do and where we come from, and I remember her saying, Rhea, if you just focus on our basic human rights, you're playing. And that hit me really hard. And it's always stuck with me, because we might be looking at things from a specific perspective because of where we come from, but I can say right here with you folks too, we're relatively privileged. And we have to acknowledge that. You know, for a multitude of reasons. And so it really brings it outside of myself and my experience, my family, my community, my, you know, upbringing, to a much further, the global community, and how classism impacts us all. And it really is about class at the core. And it takes it right back. And so it's a great grounding mechanism for me in my work. Thank you
so much to think about. I did actually choose a quote by Paulo Freire, an educator, and he talked about class, you know, and race. You cannot separate those two, because ultimately when we talk about caste and class differences, it really does have to come down to material resources, right? Wealth.
Yeah.
It's real. That's material reality, right? And we cannot not talk about it. In the end, I decided to go with, I don't want to use my words, can I just read?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm in a book club recently we're reading this book called Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning by Kathy Park Hong. And it really, really resonated with me. So I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts. When I hear the phrase, Asians are next in line to be white, I replace the word white with disappear. Asians are next in line to disappear. We were reputed to be so accomplished and so law-abiding, we will disappear into this country's amnesiac fog. We will not be the power, but become absorbed by power. Not share the power of whites, but be stooges to a white ideology that exploited our ancestors. This country insists that our racial identity is beside the point, that it has nothing to do with being bullied, or passed over for promotion, or cut off every time we talk. Our race has nothing to do with this country even, which is why we're often listed as others in polls, and why we're hard to find in racial breakdowns or reported rape, or workplace discrimination, or domestic abuse. Mind you, she's Asian American from the United States, but I think there's a lot of commonality here. And I would also like to insert that privilege that you talked about. There's another kind of privilege that I enjoy. I'm privileged to be in community with some amazing individuals here, also of the original inhabitants of this land, from whom I'm learning, and I continue to want to learn from them and walk the path with them. It's like being ghosted, where deprived of all social cues, I have no relational gauge for my own behavior. I ransack my mind for what I could have done, could have said. I stop trusting what I see, what I hear. My ego is in free fall, while my superego is boundless, raving that my existence is not enough, never enough. So I become compulsive in my efforts to do better, be better, blindly following this country's gospel of self-interest, proving my individual worth by expanding my network until I vanish. I began this book as a dare to myself. I still clung to a prejudice that writing about my racial identity was minor and non-urgent, a defense that I had to pry open to see what throbbed beneath it. Moreover, I had to contend with this we. I wished I had the confidence to bludgeon the public with we like 1,000 trumpets against them. But I feared the weight of my experiences as East Asian, professional class, cis female, atheist, contrarian, tipped the scales of a racial group that remained so non-specific that I wondered if there was any shared language between us. And so, like a snail's antenna that's been touched, I retracted the first person in the world. And I know it sounds all sad and down, but that community, like just hearing reverberates internally and never hearing it actually articulated, and then when you do, it's just so comforting, the reprieve, knowing that you're not alone and sharing these feelings. And so my commitment is to, within my community, to keep raising, these stories. I'm not brown. Like, my experience is different. I do stand in solidarity, and I see, right, the commonality between our experiences. But that is the part that always nags at me. It's that absence, that disappearance, that erasure. And we are also partly, we need to also take on that responsibility to raise that as well. So that's my sharing.
Thank you. That was a really good point. Yeah.
Okay, I had to also print it out as well. So I've been doing tours at the Sikh Heritage Museum for 12 years now. And when I began doing tours of the heritage site, I would tell a very nostalgic story about how the lumber company that the Sikh men worked at, the Abbotsford Lumber Company, donated the lumber to the men to build the Gurdwara. And I did this for about 8 years, and everybody would be like, what a lovely story, white people giving lumber to the Gurdwara. And then I discovered a couple of years ago 2 newspaper articles from our local Abbotsford Massey News. The first newspaper article was that the founding father of the Abbotsford Lumber Company was the first to pay to become a KKK member in Abbotsford. So there's a newspaper article that I posted on Twitter, you can read it, and it says, S.D. Chitui stood up and said, I will become the first member of the Abbotsford KKK. The second story from the same newspaper is from 1930 that said the lumber company fired all 40-50 Orientals who had been working in the mill for 3 generations because white supremacists said, fire them. They're competition for labor. I stopped telling that nostalgic story in its halfness, and I started telling the story in its fullness. And the fullness is KKK existed in the Fraser Valley, in British Columbia, and Alberta in particular quite a bit as well. The fullness is labor competition is a narrative that has been set against Asian Canadian communities or Asian communities since the late 19th century, mid 19th century until today, right? And not just against Asian communities. You hear that rhetoric against racialized communities now, right? The competition for labor. But what I want to read is a poem from Gudder rights. So the Gudder movement was a revolutionary movement that took place in the early 20th century. These were Sikh men mostly who recited poetry as an act of resistance. So they would, they were illiterate in the traditional sense of what we would think is literacy versus illiteracy. So they couldn't read or write, but wow, did they have memorization like I've never seen before. Like oral history telling is an art and a knowledge in itself. So they would recite pages and pages of poetry in the Gurdwara spaces to rally people up. And they would say, resist the racism. So the poem that I'm going to read is translated from the Gudder Leher de Kavita, which is the collection of Gudder poetry, from June of 1914. Come, let's go. Let's move forward and flee to Canada. Let's go and find some work there. Let's travel around and see the country well, since we are sitting around for long, and now is the time to move. It's not good to sit idle on a foreign land. Let's unite with the ones who came before. Let's plant our seeds in the fields and do business. Together we all prosper plentifully. The white people of this province are unreasonably cruel, jealous they are of us. They bypass the truth and justice totally, ignoring the rights of others, nor they think of giving rights. Just beautiful is this part of Canada, but they elbow us down here. Let's hunt the whole nation where truthful are the people at least. Now there's a lot of unpacking in this poem, including all of us talking about a lack of awareness of whose land they are on. This is 1913, right? A lot of concepts around openness of land that is just right for them, which is problematic. But I read this as a historian in 1914. And imagine, and the 1914 is the same year the Commandeer ship arrived as well, right? So I read this in its historical moment in that capsule of 1914, and I envision the Gutherites sitting in the Gurdwara saying, something is wrong here, something is so terribly wrong. And they are able to articulate that through poetry. so the Gudler poetry to me is transformative. It's transformative because more than 100 years ago, for all along the Pacific coast, this poetry was read. In every Gurdwara space, this poetry was read. The last line I have is just from Bell Hooks, because I was debating on what to read out, and I love Bell Hooks. One line only. She said, "There can be no love without justice." And I just want us to, to remind us about the human rights line that Rana Ayub said, right? When we talk about our rights, it's very easy to talk and couch it in comfortable language around love. But if we have no justice, you can't even talk about love. Give us justice first, then we'll talk about love. And that's why Bell Hooks to me is just radical.
Because we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion.
Yeah.
We want to get to justice.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you. This was absolutely amazing. I want you guys to open it up to them. We're going to open it up to questions, comments, etc. from everyone sitting here with us right now. We have about half an hour before we move on to enjoy the refreshments, which we hope all of you will join us for. If anyone has any questions, feel free. And of course, the first I want you to do is read out this book, which I keep doing on the side. Can everyone go and get this book, please, and read it in case you haven't heard this before? Okay. And it says, if decolonization was an event at all, its essential philosophical meaning lies in an active will to community. As others used to speak of a will to power, its goals was to realize a shared project, to stand up on one's own and to create a heritage. These ideals acted as catalysts and served to impose a new redistribution of language and a new logic of sense and life through praxis. And that's kind of where I thought everything that we've said in our everyday life also translates into the way that people have been talking about decolonization across the world. On that note, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask or comment. I actually wanted to ask you guys as well that, we've talked about transitions, we've talked about the work that you do, and I was wondering if you could comment on lessons. So what you think is one thing that you wish that perhaps people had talked about earlier, or one thing that you'd like to tell the audience that is something that you'd like them to reflect on afterwards. If there was one thing, what would it be? And I'm not talking about a pedantic lesson necessarily, just something that comes from the experiences you guys have shared with us. Please.
Being an activist, as we talked about, is draining. It can be deflating. But I have learned in the past 2 years in particular, since I've been really, really active, is that it becomes really easy to stick to people's negative comments about you or people's whatever, anything negative. But if we can spend time concentrating on the positive impacts that we have made, and I guarantee you when you do this work, there will be people who come up to you and say, wow, like this has impacted me. Wow, like something you've done or said has impacted me. It's a tool. It's actually a really important tool to always remind ourselves that there is good, so much good being done, and to put the negative aside. Because I've fallen into that trap, right? Where I'm just in the negative and the incel, like, evil world of social media, which can get so bad. But then you remind yourself, no, like there are these moments, there are these people, there are these comments, and it's actually a tool to just remind ourselves of the positivity of there.
Great noise listening. Yeah, you did. So Sharn, that was so perfect. I have prepared a second book, and it really goes with, and I'm wearing it. So I've got some really great siblings here with me. We did a book club last year on this by Mariam Kaba. We do this till we free us. And the quote on the back of my shirt is, "Hope is a discipline." And in this, it's 3 pages, but I mean, I've highlighted so many things. So she's saying that hope is not an optimism, but how do we sustain ourselves doing this kind of hard. It's hard for our souls, it's hard for our heart, it's hard for our body, right? Like our bodies react to this. And I just find this really nourishing. So not so much a lesson, but more of a reflection. It says here, self-care is really tricky for me because I don't believe in the self in the way that people determine it here in this capitalist society that we live in. I don't believe in self-care. I believe in collective care. Collectivizing our care and thinking more about how we can help each other. How can we collectivize the care of children so that more people can feel like they can actually have their kids, but also live in the world and contribute and participate in various different ways? How do we do that? So I think it's an invitation to being creative. And I think, a lot of people have the idea of what an activist is, but I think, we have different strengths and different skills, different things to contribute, right? And just kind of thinking more creatively about how we can support those who might be doing the more traditional activism, and also think about there are activism like parents, like you can be on the path, you can be raising your voices, you can, like if you're a social media ninja, right? Like just kind of think of the different ways that you could be supporting this work together.
Yeah, for me, it's more of probably a learning lesson. When I was young and I faced racism, we think of racism as someone yelling, "Go home, Hindu." It's not always like that. Sometimes it's different, and there's different types of racism. And I hope that and this is something to leave with you folks, is had I been this age now, at this time, I would hope that someone was sharing what types of racism there are. Why? To validate. It is extremely important to validate what that person is going through and acknowledge. That has power in and of itself, because once you know what you're feeling, you're able to then look at why you're feeling that way. And then you get to dig deeply inside yourself. And as a child, like we all said, I think, and we agreed in the conversation today, we do absorb and we do learn really quickly. And I think that many of us feel what we're feeling and going through in isolation. And instead of going closer to community, you actually dip further away. And because you want to protect and shield yourself. And I think it's, if you have the ability, or you are around someone, especially our youth, that we are having this discussion about what types of racism exist and what does it look like, and concrete examples to give them knowledge. And that way, if something happens to them that makes them feel badly being young, they're able to understand what happened. It makes a big difference. Just because I suffered doesn't make
Thank you so much for that. Are there?
I just want to say thank you so much for putting that into words. That is 100% my experience and why I'm doing this today. So I just want to share that education, our educators, and we are listening, and the ministry is listening. So I just got off of a weekend downstairs of this building, or upstairs of this building, in the Ministry of Education office on a anti-racism teacher guide project. And so I've been taking crazy notes because I wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically of what you would like to be in the hands of 80,000 instructors in BC come September.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What would you like to see?
Are you literally asking us what he owns?
I have an answer for you. Sometimes we go to our professors or our teachers because we're not feeling well, we're sick. If someone is feeling the impact of racism and that is the reason cited, let them have the day off if that's what they need.
Real resources, not words, actions, and it's going to cost. So put that money in there. Like statements, studies, I mean, they're important, data collection, all of that is important, but really, we don't need more studies. We don't need more data to prove that racism exists. Just do the work and put the money in there, hire the people. Also, hire Indigenous educators.
Yes.
They can't tell us to do reconciliation when they're not hiring the people who really should be there. Children need to see them in that role.
And the pushback can't be, well, they're not applying, or that's the typical
That's the
response.
biggest cop.
Yeah,
And it's
biggest,
bullshit.
yeah, completely.
The
So-
system needs to change to that they need to go to them and invite them in and not just stand here and say, well, they're not coming.
The other real problem is like, so as somebody who is an educator, but also seeing everything through my kids' eyes and being on the PAC, being on the exec, being a fighter in the school, I see two things that are a major problem. One is, in Abbotsford anyways, everything is centralized, giving administrators way too much fucking power. Holy shit, they are such a problem, administrators. Oh my god. They are some of the most horrible, yeah, is he an administrator? I'm sure you're amazing.
I said
But I find it's very centralized in Abbotsford is my experience, right? Like I find like there is this very strange autonomy that administrators have, and every educator is terrified of being creative. When the CBC did a beautiful video tour of me giving kids a tour of the Heritage Gurdwara. He wanted to have a grade 4 teacher, who I adore, a white teacher, come because she does amazing things. She couldn't do it because she was so terrified of what the administrator would say or jumping through hoops and going, and I was like, are you serious? Like you literally couldn't just come and say, yeah, like this is amazing. That's one thing. The other thing is that white privilege has not been understood properly by educators, especially white educators. And I don't think it can be done through words. You're absolutely right. Reading, what's that woman's name who's made billions of dollars? The white woman, Peggy, reading her, reading her isn't going to help. Don't read Robin DiAngelo to learn about white privilege. The educators really need to understand their privilege, and they don't. And like I said, my lens is all Abbotsford, and I know Vancouver's very different, Burnaby's very different, Richmond's very different. I know there's more diversity there, but Fraser Valley is a real mess. Yeah, you can tell them that too. Fraser Valley is a real mess.
Oh,
is it?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. She's here to make you feel bad.
I'm sorry.
Not so. But yeah, that would be my couple of things. Good luck with that.
But the thing that I took out of the weekend is that the guy running it, he used to work for the BCTF,
Yeah.
and he was saying that he has seen changes within the ministry. So he was like, don't lose hope, you know, there's 10 of us sitting around our room like trying to throw everything at the wall, but
Yeah.
I think that, you know, you're right, like positive, like focus on the positive, and there is change, there are people doing it.
Yeah.
And like, Heidi said like she knew you, and she was like, oh, look at me, it's nice. Anyway, so like there are people out here, and I think that for me, I'm finding a community. So thank you.
Oh.
Can I just say one thing? And I have friends to corroborate on this point. Jennifer Whiteside, the Minister of Education, declined our petition asking for 2 in-service days of training in this school year that's ending soon to read with our school community, the TRC, calls to action, and the UNDRIP. She said no. Okay, the ministry said no. So, just so you know.
And that's foundational. That is foundational. UNDRIP and TRC calls out. It's foundational for academics too.
All we want is to read, learn, and reckon. Minister Whiteside didn't want that.
The petition is still open. Sign it. We have over 2,000
Where is
signatures.
wow? Where?
AOEC.ca. I also want to say that when we do this work, we get blacklisted. We get shamed. You know, the ministry opened up that, selective process for looking at the curriculum, but they really selected who they were going to have there because they didn't want people who were going to talk about structural change. So educators, there's a lot of white privilege, but for those of us that are pushing the system and interrupting and disrupting, we're now being slandered and we're being presented as a problem. And we need folks to recognize that we're in this together. And the lateral violence that happens in our communities, we really have to root it out, and we have to see that it's about class. You know, they want nice anti-racism. Anti-racist work, anti-oppressive work is not about nice.
Yeah,
It's not about bad, it's not about any of those things. It's about where power is at.
Yeah.
And if we can't have those discussions, we're not going to change anything. Public education is inherently from a genocidal formation, which was to root out Indigenous people on these lands. And when you look at the anti-racist curriculum being delivered in the province of British Columbia, they will not acknowledge that. That's a problem.
They don't acknowledge the word genocide, like that whole
You can get disciplined in the province of British Columbia for using that word inappropriately. Yes, it's a problem. You know, teachers are muzzled. Teachers that want to do this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave the floor open if anyone else has any questions as well. Yes, please, Sharanjit.
To say about what you said, anti-racism is a long struggle. The first time I talked about racism was 1973 in the union meeting. And that's why I got up. I just can't sit and talk. I have to stand up.
Can you please introduce yourself and your past? Just
My name is Sharanjit.
And he was the head of the BC Organization to Fight Racism, one of the founding people against it, fought a long struggle for
Canadian
equality.
Farm Workers Union.
Yeah. Oh, wow. And the current president of Western
No introduction needed for
We
either.
have to be hopeful. We have to be hopeful. One of my friends passed away a couple of years ago, was St. Banerjee, was a prof at SFU, English language prof. Every now and then we would call a meeting on this issue or that issue. We would expect 500 people to show up, and you go to the meeting room, there 10 people showed up. I'd be kind of disappointed. He could say, brother, it's a long struggle. We have to carry on. Think positively. 10 people were there to talk about, anti-racism. And so, don't be discouraged. In 1907, Vancouver Labour Council established Asiatic Exclusion League to keep Orientals out, keep South Asians out. And the same group now is staunch anti-racism. They established the anti-racism committee. Seema Ahluwalia is the heading that group. So we have to be hopeful. The other comment I wanted to make to all of you, those of us from South Asian community, particularly coming from India, we have to fight caste system day in, day out, much more so than we fight racism here. I mean, it's so real. We just fight it.
So prevalent.
Yeah, so prevalent, so prevalent. But carry on, all of you, carry on. It's a long struggle. Don't be disheartened. You may turn your gray hair and still be talking about these issues. But we have made changes. We have made changes in the last 50 years. I'm sure we will make changes in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And carry on.
Thank you so much.
I've been doing that work since the 1970s, and Uncle G still has the smile on his face and to say, don't be disheartened. Like, wow, that's beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I just wanted everyone to reflect on what these amazing people have shared. Before I joined the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, shortly before that, something happened so my son goes to a school in Burnaby. I won't name the school, but I am a very recent immigrant. It's literally been 3 years. And I carry all these things with me that I don't like advertising, and I never liked advertising. advertising, including the fact that, for example, I wouldn't advertise the fact that I am Muslim, but I do love my faith at home. And my son, in his school, there was an educator who left, and we were told, we were sent letters that the children had been calling that educator who covered her head a terrorist. And that the kids, keep in mind that these kids who are collectively together playing and in that daycare where this incident took place that's at the same school, are all between 7 and 14. And at the end of the day, kids are innocent, right? But they're hearing it from somewhere. And they said they're making fun of that, and the kids are also making fun of the color of each other's skin. And that, I mean, again, coming from a context where I have never experienced any kind of racism growing up. I grew up in Lahore, right? And so when I came here, I was completely taken aback by that. And I've also never really talked about religion. I had this comfortable sort of space where I was like, you can grow up as you want, and so on. Yeah. And then when I had that conversation, I realized he had imbibed those things without ever having heard them from his parents. And it was only with joining these guys and reaching out to people who form community and then saying, okay, you know what, we need to do a speaker series, we need to keep connecting and engaging more and more people, is how it feels like, okay, this is space in which we can go on and keep doing great things. The point of saying that is please stay connected. I would love to stay in touch with any of you who are interested in doing this work. I would love to leverage whatever platform I can get. This is what Rohini does.
I got enough heat on this.
This is what Rohini does. This is what Rohini does. This is what Sharn does. We're amazing. And they're all like, oh, you want to do this work? Let me tell you. A, B, C. These are the people. Get in touch. If you mean it, show us that you mean it. Okay? Gather people together. So whatever you guys are doing, we want to support you and we want to connect, and let's keep it going. Thank you so much for being here. Please join us for the refreshments at the back.